Over the years, the Final Fantasy franchise has introduced many types of jobs to the player, with there now being literally hundreds within the wider roster. But whenever jobs do appear, time and effort is always placed around making sure they reflect both the design philosophy and the narrative needs of the game. To that end, some jobs are more common than others depending on the job functions. Black mages and white mages are therefore some of the more frequent due to the benefit they bring via their spellcasting. On the other hand, jobs like the Gambler only show up occasionally throughout the franchise because they have specific mechanics that don't play well with certain narratives or gameplay systems. But even when the same jobs do appear across multiple games, there's almost always some kind of unique flair that helps to distinguish them from the other iterations. It means there are most definitely instances of recurring or unique jobs that are more powerful than others. And in this video, we are going to cover 7 of the most powerful jobs that at times can even feel a bit broken. As per usual though, we are only going to feature one job per game, as well as one iteration of each job. And we're going to start things off with a powerhouse, the Sword Saint from Final Fantasy Tactics. By the time Final Fantasy Tactics launched, jobs had become a prominent part of the Final Fantasy setup. So, when Hiroyuki Ito worked with Yasumi Matsuno to figure out how they could convert Final Fantasy into becoming a tactical role-playing game, it was decided that jobs would be made one of the fundamental elements of gameplay. Similar to Final Fantasy 3 and 5, the majority of jobs were part of an extensive job chain system. Jobs could be switched between at any time, and new jobs were made available after certain criteria had been met. However, unlike Final Fantasy 3 and 5, Tactics also featured a host of unique jobs that were locked to specific characters, and one of the most notable and powerful was the Sword Saint. This special job belonged to Sidolphus Orlando, and its effectiveness was tied to him as a character. And this was then further enhanced by Cid being equipped with a knight's sword Excalibur. What made the Sword Saint powerful, however, outside of Cid's attributes and the use of Excalibur, was the array of available sword techniques and how strong they each were. Holy Sword, for example, would deal damage equal to Cid's physical attack attribute multiplied by the strength of his equipped weapon plus 5. And what made this even more effective was that none of the Sword Saint command abilities required any MP to use, and almost all of them were paired with some kind of debilitating status effect. Crush Weapon, for example, had the chance to deal high damage while also destroying the opponent's weapon, while Northswain Strike was laced with the KO status effect. Duskblade and Shadowblade then complemented this by allowing Cid to drain huge amounts of HP and MP, something that provided sustain should the going get a little tough. It meant Cid was nothing short of a one-man army, if used in the correct manner. The Blue Mage job was first introduced in Final Fantasy V, and compared to many of the other jobs available to the player, it was quite unique. At this point in the franchise, players have been exposed to numerous mage jobs, but although they had started to deviate away from the standard white and black magic, they were still rather fundamental in how they operated. Aside from the red mage job, the majority of them were not considered capable of performing any significant physical feats, and to expand their knowledge, they relied on the acquisition of scrolls or tomes. Blue mages were designed to be different. Instead of learning magic through traditional means, they learnt skills or magic from enemies by being exposed to them in combat. And after this event happened, they could then claim the technique as their own. Ever since Final Fantasy V, Blue mages have been semi-recurring, but they are often shoehorned in, or there is some kind of fun luxury. That wasn't the case in Final Fantasy V though, as their abilities covered a broad spectrum of use cases. And although it would take some time and effort for them to ascend, these elements combined to make Blue Mages a very powerful and effective solution to solving the game's combat challenges. This power would start to shine through once a blue mage learnt both Mighty Guard and White Wind. This made parties become almost invincible in certain circumstances, as Mighty Guard granted the float, shell, and protect status effects, and White Wind restored HP to the entire party in an amount equal to the HP of the caster. This combination of spells significantly reduced the damage the whole party took, while recovering HP faster than it could be lost. But this was just one side of the blue mage. From an offensive perspective, not only did blue mages gain access to powerful spells for rarer elements like Aqua Breath or Aero, but they also had access to classic attacks like 1000 Needles and Goblin Punch. And then there was also level 3 Flare, which served as a more powerful version of the traditional Flare spell, with the caveat that it would only affect enemies whose level was a multiple of 3. Blue mages also had the capacity to wield effective enfeebling spells such as Mini, Toad, and Old, and just like red mages, they could even deal moderate physical damage. In short, within the realm of Final Fantasy V, blue mages were the job-based equivalent of the Swiss Army knife. Even though jobs were given a much softer role in Final Fantasy VI than they were in Final Fantasy V, there was still plenty of room for innovation. And one of the new jobs that featured, even though it was censored out from the original North American release of the game, was the Assassin. This job was assigned to Shadow, who excelled at dealing damage when using his throw ability. But even though this was effective, it was overshadowed by the next iteration of Assassin, which appeared within Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. In this particular game, assassins were known for their extremely high stat growth, particularly when it came to the speed stat. This meant assassins were often the fastest units within the combat setting, something that enabled them to use their effective abilities on a regular basis. And this then helped them to blast through enemy forces by repeated use of abilities such as Ultima Masher. Ultima Masher was a 999 AP ability associated with the Zanmato, and it had the ability to deal massive amounts of damage. Despite not being a formal one-hit kill ability, it effectively acted as one in many situations due to just how strong it was. But should that ability not yet be available, the Assassin did also have an ability that fulfilled the same objective as Last Breath, despite having a relatively low success rate, was designed to deliver an instant KO. What then made the Assassin very powerful though was when Last Breath was combined with the Concentrate ability, which increased accuracy. It could make Last Breath almost always hit, and this was very valuable in Tactics Advance because there were plenty of enemies who were susceptible to instant kill abilities. Now, from the outset, Takashi Tokita wanted Final Fantasy The Four Heroes of Light to be a modern adaptation of the old 8-bit and 16-bit Final Fantasy games. It was for this reason that jobs were made a fundamental part of the game design, although to provide an element of differentiation, they were renamed to crowns. Although some traditional jobs did return, plenty of new ones were introduced, and they each operated in weird and wonderful ways. The Seamstress, for example, provided support for the party by using unequipped gear to strengthen attacks, and even combining party members together, while the party host motivated the party by creating just the right environment. And then there was the Merchant job, which is often underappreciated due to its mechanics, but it was those mechanics that made it incredibly overpowered. Central to the Merchant's effectiveness was how deep your pockets were, and provided you had enough gil, you could essentially make the game almost impossible to lose. This was because gil enabled the Merchant to enter the fight with perfect defense and an absurdly strong offensive capability. Once a suitable amount of gil had been acquired, the Ransom ability would come to the fore. Ransom would lead to all damage being converted from HP to gil, so receiving 500 damage from an enemy meant losing 500 gil rather than 500 HP. What made this effective was that it lasted the entire duration of the encounter, provided the player had enough gil to absorb all of the damage received. This was then complemented by the Money Talks ability, which was a much stronger version of the classic Gil Toss ability. In most games, Gil Toss deals more damage depending on how much Gil is spent, but Money Talks only require players to pay a flat rate of 1000 Gil. Then, it would deal damage equal to a percentage of how much Gil was spent in relation to the total amount of Gil the player had in their possession. It meant, if you happened to have a huge, ridiculous amount of Gil, you could deal massive damage consistently each turn when only spending 1000 Gil. Ever since their introduction in Final Fantasy III, summoners have been ever present. But some games have elevated their status within the narrative, providing them with incredible gameplay application. And perhaps the most prominent example of this has to be Final Fantasy X. Even though the game only had a soft job system with parts of the sphere grid partitioned off to focus on different areas, Yuna was locked in as the game's summoner based on lore. And it was for this reason that her gameplay application was pretty incredible. Unlike previous Final Fantasy games, where summons would come forth via intense sequences, deal damage, and then leave, Final Fantasy X differed by having the Aeon replace the party for a finite period of time. This meant that while the Aeon was there, the entire party was made immune to damage. As this continued until the Aeon was either defeated or dismissed, it meant Yuna was effectively able to deal free damage, and due to the nature of the mechanic, that damage had the potential to be huge. This notion was further elevated via Yuna's overdrive, called Grand Summon. During a regular summoning, Aeons would need to perform moves or take damage to build up their overdrive gauge, before then being able to deal their most powerful attack when it was full. But by using Grand Summon, Aeons would be summoned with a full overdrive gauge. This could be pushed even further, however. Because Aeons had their own individual overdrive gauges, they could be stacked up before a challenging fight. And due to how the mechanic worked, Yuna could chain Aeon summoning, meaning she could essentially perform all of their overdrives back to back. As if this wasn't enough, Yuna also had access to Yojimbo. This optional Aeon was game-breaking in its own right, able to instantly kill any enemy in the game, including penance, should enough Gil be provided. Final Fantasy X-2 reverted back to a more formalised job system via dress spheres. The base game had quite a wide selection available to the player, but the developers decided to add a few more in to make the release of Final Fantasy X-2 International a bit more tantalising. One of these new dress spheres was the Psychic, and it could be obtained by completing the standard cup in the Fiend Arena. But despite how relatively easy it was to obtain, once equipped, it had the potential to make whoever adopted the dress sphere very hard to kill. The Psychic automatically converted elemental and gravity damage to HP through various Eater abilities like Fire Eater and Gravity Eater. This naturally negated many sources of damage in the game, while also reducing the need to heal from sources of damage that could still affect the Psychic. However, the Psychic could become fully invulnerable to damage if the entire party equipped ribbons. Beyond this, the Psychic dress sphere also had access to an ability called Telekinesis, which was an instant kill ability that only cost 12 MP. Instant kill abilities are often hit and miss, but this version was far more powerful because of how high its hit rate was, and with quite a large number of enemies being susceptible to the status in X-2, it made it very potent. Then there was Express, an extremely powerful support ability that granted haste on the caster as well as greatly increasing accuracy and evasion. This amplified the Psychic's DPS capabilities through two avenues, while further increasing its ability to avoid damage. And with all of these elements combined, it's easy to see why the Psychic was an incredibly potent addition to the game. That then brings us on to the Onion Knight from the Final Fantasy III Remake. In the original version of Final Fantasy III, the default job was known as the Onion Knight. It had no special abilities, had limited equipment options, and compared to many of the other jobs, it had middling to poor attributes. Even its name was a bit of a joke. The story goes that after seeing the concept art, Hiromichi Tanaka commented that it looked like the helmet was sprouting an onion. The name stuck, and they even went further by positioning the job as infantile and playful. Much of this turned out to be ironic, however, as once the player reached level 90 in the original game, the Onion Knight's stats increased exponentially. Whereas at level 80 they would only have 13 in each attribute, at level 90 Onion Knights would have 36, increasing to 71 by level 95 and 99 when they hit level 99. At this point, Onion Knights could also equip the Onion set, namely the Onion Sword and the individual pieces of Onion armor. For the remake, elements of this notion remained, but the concept was flipped on its head. Instead of being the starter job, the Onion Knight was made into a secret ultimate job. It retained the same stat progression, although it was made a bit slower, and they could still wear the Onion equipment set. However, whereas the Famicom version of the Onion Knight had no command ability, the Onion Knight in the 3D remake had access to all level 1 to 8 black and white magic. Therefore, having 4 high-level Onion Knights wearing a full set of Onion equipment basically breaks the game. Players are able to defeat almost any enemy instantly, and it's almost a necessity for tackling the Iron Giant, the resident superboss in the 3D remake of Final Fantasy III. For this reason, the Onion Knight is one of the most powerful jobs ever created in relation to the Final Fantasy franchise. But be sure to let us know in the comments below if there were any others you feel deserved a place on the list. And of course, if you enjoyed the video, please feel free to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Gregory, Juan Jaramillo, Justin Dent, and Zukin TDK, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.